Despite tracing its origins in ancient India and Greece, democracy is not a common form of government in human history. In fact, in comparison to monarchy, democracy falls way behind and is still not prevalent all over the world in the modern age. Somehow, monarchs and regents have always been the norm in history, and they were always pictured as these semi-divine beings who were above the law that they made and were served by servants and courtiers who willingly submitted their will to their royal families. What made these courtiers, nobles, attendants, and advisors give their fealty to these rulers? What were their lives like serving the regents? Welcome to Nutty History, and today let's find out what life was like as servants of the kings and queens. The Kingmaker. Thanks to the massive popularity of the Game of Thrones, the actual historical political conflict that serves as the inspiration for the popular fiction series The Wars of Roses has become contextual again. Characters like Littlefinger, Ned Stark, and Tywin Lannister have suddenly made medieval politics cool in modern times. Interestingly, just like the war between Lannisters and Starks, the real war between Lancaster and Yorks too had a shifty character that played a huge part in turning the tides of the Wars of the Roses, Richard Neville, often addressed as the Kingmaker. It's one thing to be a loyal servant of your king, but it's another to be the reason behind him sitting on the throne. Born on November 22, 1428, Richard Neville was the eldest son of the Earl of Salisbury, but became the 14th Earl of Warwick himself at the mere age of 21 by marrying the beautiful daughter of Richard Beauchamp, the 13th Earl of Warwick. However, his accomplishments got murky when King Henry IV granted the Duke of Somerset control of Glamorgan. Until Beauchamp's rule, Glamorgan was a Warwick territory, and as Somerset's influence in London grew, Neville got disillusioned by the royal court and threw his support to the Duke of York, Neville's uncle by marriage, in the bid to oust the sickly and incapacitated king. Neville got his revenge on the Duke of Somerset in the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, as Yorks won but did not gain any influence. Queen Margaret, wife of Henry IV, didn't like Richard Neville much. She sent the new Duke of Somerset and Lord Clifford to attack the Yorkist forces at Sandal Castle during Christmas festivities with a force of 6,000 men. The Battle of Wakefield was pretty much the real red wedding of the Wars of Roses. As the Christmas celebration turned into bloodshed, the Duke of York and his son Earl of Rutland lost their lives along with Neville's father Earl of Salisbury and his younger brother Thomas, who was captured and eliminated. Further defeat on February 17, 1461, at the Second Battle of St. Albans led to a Yorkist retreat, leaving behind King Henry VI, who is said to have spent the battle sitting under a tree, singing. It was Richard Neville's responsibility to now make sure that Lancastrian forces were defeated and Richard's son Edward would be proclaimed the king. This resulted in the largest and deadliest battle of the Wars of the Roses, the Battle of Towton. Both armies were more or less 30,000 strong, and nearly 28,000 people succumbed during the battle, and more were severely wounded and/or captured. The Lancasters suffered most of these losses, and their army was dispersed and demolished. King Henry IV and his Queen Margaret fled to Scotland, and Richard Neville made Edward IV new ruler of England. However, as most of the nobility stayed indifferent to change of power or remained loyal to Henry IV, Edward had to rely on the Earl of Warwick, who held most responsibilities himself. Not only did he continue to serve as Captain of Calais, but he was given the position of High Admiral of England and Steward of the Duchy of Lancaster. He became the hand of the king, so to speak, in the Game of Thrones language. Thanks to his father's death in Wakefield, Neville saw massive growth in his wealth and assets as he inherited both his father's and mother's properties. His brother was no more. But just as Robb Stark's emotional decision to marry a southern girl cost him the betrayal of Roose Bolton, Edward IV's hasty decision to marry Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of a Lancastrian knight, hurt his relations with Neville. As Neville was trying to negotiate a nuptial deal with Bona of Savoy, Edward's shotgun wedding drew a wedge between the two. To add insult to the injury, Edward IV soon replaced Neville with his father-in-law, Richard Woodville, the Earl of Rivers. Richard Neville had survived until now by being stealthy, cunning, and daring, and he employed those traits once again to instigate a rebellion against Edward IV. He also took Edward's younger brother to Calais and had him marry his daughter as a show of defiance. The rebellion ended with Edward IV being imprisoned and Neville beheading Woodville and his sons. However, the court united against Neville and the Kingmaker was exiled with the king restored to the throne. Back to square one, Neville made a bold move by approaching exiled Margaret of Anjou, who had returned to France. The long-term enemies, Richard Neville and Lancasters, then allied against York's and waited for York to become highly unpopular, which was an inevitability. Neville's plan was to help Lancasters retake England and avenge his humiliation. A year later, Neville returned to England, this time to make Henry VI the new king as York's lost virtually all support in London. With the tables turned, the Earl of Warwick settled scores with Edward. The king fled to Bruges, but with Lancasters having no love for him, Neville never regained the same amount of power in the new regime. On April 14, 1471, Neville ended up losing his life at the Battle of Barnet, along with 1,500 men as Edward struck back and regained his rule over England, this time without the aid of any kingmaker. The Silver-Tongued Eunuch. Every dynasty and empire in the history of humanity has had a dedication faction of servants, employees, or materials that either acted or served on their behalf or protected them. The Ottomans had the Janissaries, the Egyptians had Medjay, and the Chinese dynasties had eunuchs. There was a time when the job of a eunuch servant in the Forbidden City was so coveted by peasants that they would intentionally mutilate their children's genitals just to have a shot at this highly competitive employment. The story of one named Tongguan was no different. With a poor background, no human rights, unpassable obstacles, and a lack of funds, he was left with very few options. He opted to become a eunuch and try his luck at royal service, and to his good fortune, the sacrifice of genitals turned out to be worth it. Or was it? Would you do the same in a similar situation? Tell us in the comments. Though most eunuchs in Chinese history are known to be soft-spoken, cunning, shrewd, and operating from the shadows, Tongguan was a different breed. He was perhaps one of the manliest eunuchs to ever serve a Chinese emperor, and was known for his peak physical condition, martial prowess, and long, charming beard, which was considered unusual and unconventional for eunuchs in ancient China. He was allowed to join the military in the 1080s under the charge of another eunuch general under the rule of the Song dynasty. During this time, China was divided and the Song dynasty was barely holding on to northern China. In 1104, Emperor Haizong, who came into power in 1100, witnessed his brilliance on a battlefield during the invasion of Western Xia. He then proved his mettle once again by commanding a series of victorious battles in the northwest against the Tanguts and rose sharply to become the military advisor of the emperor. After crushing the rebellion, Tongguan was treated like a brother by Emperor Haizong, and Tongguan saw this as an opportunity to create his legacy. On a personal level, he was already given a special place in history by the emperor. In 1116, he became the first eunuch in the Song dynasty to gain entry into the top echelons of the central administration as one of the chief policymakers. The emperor gifted him a valuable document of his own calligraphy written in a unique, slender gold style. He was also one of only 10 palace eunuchs who had their biographies compiled and written for the court. Haizong also gave Tongguan genuine respect as a brother, so it wasn't just a token gesture. Tongguan was involved in all of the elite social gatherings of the time, as his name appeared as a guest on numerous lists for organized parties and banquets hosted by Emperor Haizong. But you know what? Greed got the best of him soon enough, and Tongguan began using his influence over the emperor for his gain. He collided with Kaijing to push out other officials in the court and appointed his family and friends as officials in different government departments. Tong controlled the military for 20 years, and as he aged, he lost many battles against Liao and Jin armies. But the failures didn't cause him to lose any control over the military. He was forced to retire in 1124, but was recalled by Haizong, who was by now unable to trust anybody else. In an attempt to crush the advances of the Liao dynasty, Tongguan and Emperor Haizong allied with Jurchens despite the resistance from many courtiers. This decision eventually came to bite him on the rear, as the Jurchens invaded the Song dynasty in 1125. After Jurchens routed the Song dynasty and conquered North China, Tongguan was blamed for much of the disaster that caused the fall of the Song dynasty. Emperor Haizong's successor, Emperor Qinzong, had Tongguan executed. The servant who saved Sweden. Charles XIII was an aging, ailing, and most concerning heirless king of Sweden with one leg in the grave. The year was 1810. and the succession crisis looming over Sweden could turn into civil war at any moment. All three major powers of Europe during that time, Britain, France, and Russia, were keeping an eye on the proceedings in Sweden. Russia wanted Sweden for a long time, and Napoleon's France was okay with it. Britain was too busy fighting France and Spain to divert its attention and resources to Sweden. If civil war would have broken out, Russia would have got the perfect excuse to invite itself to Sweden to restore power. It was clear that France was the key to stopping Russia. But how? Napoleon was the most prolific personality in Europe at that moment, and if he wanted Russia to take over Sweden, it could happen, easily. A Swedish delegation was in Paris to avoid this very thing from happening, but they couldn't decide how to persuade the French Emperor, Baron Karl Otto Morner, who was a junior member of this delegation. He had next to no power to offer terms on his own, but he decided to take a shot without any authorization from the Swedish government. Morner somehow got in touch with Napoleon's people without the delegation's permission and offered the Swedish crown to one of Napoleon's marshals, Jean-Baptiste Jules Bernadotte. A ballsy move, but not a long shot in the dark. Bernadotte's rise in the French ranks was sharp during the Revolution. He became a brigadier general from sub-lieutenant in just 2 years, between 1792 to 1794. Campaigning in the Low Countries, Germany and Italy, he developed a reputation as a disciplinarian who kept his troops under tight control. It was also a risky shot because Bernadotte and Napoleon first met in 1797 and developed a friendship, but it ended eventually given how the two were often competing for the same accomplishments and had a professional rivalry going on. Despite that, Napoleon respected his talents and appointed Bernadotte Marshal of France in 1804 and then Prince of Pontecorvo in Italy in 1805. Things were worse between Bernadotte and Napoleon after Bernadotte squandered goals during the Prussian campaign in 1806 and then the Battle of Wagram in 1809, resulting in Napoleon relieving him of command. So, though it was gutsy of Morner to suggest Bernadotte, it was an opportunity for Napoleon to send Bernadotte away, and Bernadotte wouldn't mind becoming king. I mean, who would? When the Swedish government learned what Morner had done, they had him arrested, out of sheer shock and affront. But the more they thought about it, the more Bernadotte seemed a good candidate for the crown prince. In August of 1810, the Riksdag elected him crown prince. The king appointed him to command Sweden's armies, and Bernadotte became regent. Now, the only thing to worry about was to get Bernadotte's regency recognized internationally, and Napoleon's mistake of invading Russia provided the opportune moment. As winter turned the French campaign in Russia into a catastrophe, Bernadotte switched sides and signed a treaty with Britain declaring war on France and landing a Swedish army in northern Germany. He played a big part in Napoleon's defeat in Leipzig in 1813 and got the last laugh. One could say his successors are still laughing as the Bernadotte dynasty still reigns over Sweden to this day, all thanks to Baron Morner, who jumped ranks and protocols to incept the idea. The Groom of the Stool. Can the most repulsed jobs in history also be the most coveted job at the same time? Well, the Groom of the Stool definitely fits the bill of being the paradox where the two contrasting extremities meet, along with being the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. But let's focus on history for now. We all know Henry VIII of England loved to eat as much as he loved changing wives like he changed clothes. Obviously, the side effect of eating too much was that he created the fashion trend of wearing jackets top button only because of his inability of buttoning the rest of the jacket. You know, because of his massive gut. The man became so broad his own arms couldn't cover his circumference, and that made it nearly impossible for him to clean after himself. The word stool here is obviously about the royal portable commode that was carried around at all times with the king, along with water, towels, and a wash bowl by the groom of the stool so he could perform washing duties after King Big Boy had taken care of his business. The groom of the stool would also have closely monitored the king's diet and meal times so that he can be on top of the affairs, which were the king's bottom. It was a disgusting job for sure, but it was also an intimate affair to have your king be with you in their most vulnerable moments, especially because one of England's kings was taken out in the outhouse in the past. The Eliminator literally sat inside the commode and shot King Edmund with a bolt where the sun don't shine. Too bad Edmund was called Edmund Ironside and not Edmund Ironbottom. Might have saved his life. But back to the groom of the stool. The first man to be appointed for this intimate yet icky job was Sir William Compton, who was offered a large sum of £2,000. This was equal to the income of a high-tier noble during those times. Today it would be close to nearly $1.5 million US. Would you clean someone as needed for $1.5 million a year? Yeah, I thought so. Sir Compton also received knighthood solely based on his talents of butt wiping. He was given land grants, land leases, and offices by the king that made him as important as the highest-ranking bishop in the country. Because of all these perks and access, not just anybody could become the groom of the stool. This post needed some really strong connections and family backgrounds to be selected. The king only trusted their close friends or confidants and often discussed matters of politics and administration with them in the privy. Later, influential courtiers also weighed in on the selection process and used the position to get close to the king and increase their own wealth and power. Thanks to Henry VIII's inability to produce enough male heirs, the position was discontinued when his two daughters became the ruling queens, one after the other. Sir Michael Stanhope was the last appointed groom of the stool for King Edward VI in 1547 until the untimely death of the young king in 1553. But the stories of English regents and their lavatories didn't end there. Enter Sir John Harington. The saucy godson. Sir John Harington was many things: a writer, a poet, a noble, and a godson of Queen Elizabeth I. But most importantly, he's remembered as the inventor of the Flushing lavatories. His writing and poetry were not memorable. He was an amateur at best, but they were definitely provocative and raunchy, and often got him in trouble with his godmother, who did not appreciate her godson flaunting his sauciness all over her court. Okay, that didn't come out the way I meant it to, but it was true. Despite many warnings from Queen Elizabeth I, John didn't stop selling his risque stories among her courtiers, and ultimately the last Tudor queen banished him to Kelston near Bath. He spent 7 years from 1584 to 1591 in Kelston, and not only built himself a house, but also invented and installed a Flushing lavatory that he named Ajax. Despite all his mischiefs, Queen Elizabeth I truly adored John Harington and eventually began missing him. She forgave him in 1592 and visited him in Kelston. John Harington proudly showed off his invention to his godmother and invited her to try it out. His water closet had a pan with an opening at the bottom sealed with a leather-faced valve. A system of handles, levers, and weights poured in water from a cistern and opened the valve. The queen was immensely impressed by her godson's device, so she ordered one for herself as well. However, the rest of England was not enthralled and kept using chamber pots until the Victorian times. Even the royal family sort of forgot about the flushing toilet, because when Alexander Cummings visited Queen Victoria with his invention, the Flushing water closet, it was a new thing for her, and the sound flushing made scared her to death. In 1848, a Public Health Act ruled that every new house should have a WC, privy, or ash pit. It had taken nearly 250 years for Sir John Harington's water closet to become universal. Now, you can't say the British embrace all new inventions with enthusiasm, despite royal approval, but Sir Harington's contribution to modern plumbing wasn't completely forgotten. There's a reason we call toilets the John. The Eagle of Brittany. Talking about those who serve the royals, we cannot complete this video without talking about knights, the gallant paladins who were mostly known for their loyalty and duty to the crown. Bertrand du Guesclin was one such knight who was no noble by birthright, but despite having humble origins, rose through the ranks and became a French national hero. After Bertrand played an important role in stopping the English raid of Brittany in 1354, he was knighted by the King of France. Not only that, he continued his heroics to defend the honor of France by securing Rennes in 1357, and then defeated King Charles II of Navarre at the Battle of Coucherel in 1364 and forced him to abandon the Duchy of Burgundy. This prompted the French crown to make Bertrand the Constable of France. Bertrand held that position for 10 years until 1380. Later, Bertrand also led French forces in the 100 Years' War and recaptured Brittany and a large chunk of southwestern France, where he was known for his effective use of guerrilla tactics. Not to mention, Bertrand also entertained his king in tournaments and held a record of winning 12 jousts on a trot. However, like many other historical figures, dysentery defeated Bertrand after his successful siege of Châteauneuf-de-Randon in 1380. Bertrand was given the special honor to be buried alongside French kings at the Saint Denis Basilica in Paris. Ain't no jester like the farter. Like knights, jesters too are considered an important part of the medieval legends, and there was perhaps no jester like Roland the Farter. Court jester to Henry II, Roland was the medieval flautist, who was known for only one talent that he had acquired and performed: breaking wind. Apparently, he was so famous for this particular set of skills that King Henry II had him booked for every Christmas. Better known as King Henry's rip-roaringly riotous Christmas celebrations, Roland was recorded as culminating his foolery with unum saltum in syphiltum et unum bumbulum, a simultaneous jump, whistle, and fart. Okay, yeah, now we get it, why that was a talent. Though toilet humor is considered one of the lowest forms of comedy, the oldest known joke is a cutting cheese joke that hails from 20th century BC. The Sumerian joke goes something like this, something which has never occurred since time immemorial. A young woman did not fart in her husband's lap. Yeah, it's not a great one, but maybe it's a joke of its own time. The Indian Machiavelli. It's a shame that modern history has been a lot more focused on the West and not enough on the East. More research needs to be done to separate real history from the legends of these countries. Chanakya is supposed to be one of such important historical figures to walk the blurred lines between history and myths. There's also an argument about if he was real or not, but most evidence points out that he very much existed. The most prolific evidence is the book Arthashastra, a title that means economics in English. However, the book teaches a lot more than just economics, and frankly, most of the stuff is outdated now. But the book has been considered significant in ancient and medieval Indian history as the prince by Niccolo Machiavelli became in Western history. The tricky thing is that Arthashastra was written by Chanakya under the pen name Kautilya. Now, some historians argue that Kautilya and Chanakya are two entirely different people, but there's very little evidence to support that, and Kautilya was most likely Chanakya's clan name. Still, one piece of evidence that adds a lot of weight to his existence is that he was the Kingmaker who helped to found the Mauryan Empire, one of the mightiest empires to exist in the Indian subcontinent history. If stories are to be believed, Chanakya served as prime minister of 3 Mauryan emperors, Chandragupta, Bindusara, and the most well-known emperor of ancient India, Ashoka. In fact, the reason the Mauryan Empire came into existence was that Chanakya had taken slight of the humiliation he had to endure at the court of a king named Dhanananda. He had Chanakya kicked out of his court only for being not good-looking despite his qualifications and credentials. A few days later, Chanakya stumbled upon a few kids playing king's court in the woods and was impressed at the rational thinking and reasoning of a child named Chandragupta playing the king. Chanakya took him under his tutelage and spent years instructing Chandragupta on royal duties until he reached adulthood. Chanakya then raised an army and marched against King Dhanananda. Chandragupta led Chanakya's raised army to victory, and in return, Chanakya made him the new king. With Chanakya as his prime advisor, Chandragupta expanded his realm from the Hindu Kush to Bengal. Do you think we missed any names? Tell us in the comments and we may make part 2. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching Nutty History.